We are going to get started. We reward all of you for being here on time, or within a few minutes of on time. And if anyone else trickles in, well, that's okay. That means some of my clean power plan jokes. So hi, I'm Eric Hittinger, but you might know me as the guy with the hat. And I'm here to preside over this session about the Clean Power Plan. And today we have a great panel, and we're going to talk a lot about the implications of the Clean Power Plan and the strategies that different elements of the electricity market will use to respond to the new regulation. So I wanted to say a few brief things about the Clean Power Plan before handing it over to our great speakers to relieve them of the duty of bringing up the background. So a little bit of the history of the Clean Power Plan. In 2007, Massachusetts and a group of other states and environmental groups sued the EPA, the federal government, that was the Bush era EPA, basically demanding that the EPA needs to regulate CO2 and other greenhouse gases. The Supreme Court agreed and determined that CO2 was officially air pollution and that it does, quote, endanger public health or welfare, which is the wording under the Clean Air Act. The wording, it's relatively clear, was perhaps originally intended to look at direct harm from things that if you breathe them in, it causes direct physical harm. But the Supreme Court said that yes, CO2, through the indirect effect of climate change and whatnot, was air pollution and does cause human health effects. So the Obama administration used that ruling, and the EPA implemented several regulations regarding CO2, and several years later they were sued by the Utility Air Regulatory Group, which basically claimed executive overreach, that the EPA was reaching beyond the reasonable confines of the Clean Air Act, and the Supreme Court agreed with them, saying that the EPA can't regulate every single molecule of CO2 emitted by anyone or anything in the United States, that the EPA regulatory authority should be limited only to sources that are already covered under the Clean Air Act. The Obama administration took this and came up with a draft of the Clean Power Plan and released it in 2014, and immediately received 4.3 million public comments. The EPA claims that they considered or responded to every single one of those. I'm not sure I believe that, but we'll certainly try it. Yeah. And spent about a year working on those comments, made a few changes in response, and announced the final Clean Power Plan through the EPA in August of last year. Unsurprisingly, as we know, they were immediately sued by a wide variety of entities that felt they were harmed by the Clean Power Plan, including several states, utilities, and especially anyone related to the coal industry. In February of this year, the Supreme Court actually ordered EPA to halt execution of the Clean Power Plan until courts could review it. And so currently it is in limbo, the execution of the Clean Power Plan. And just last month, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit heard arguments on the Clean Power Plan. If you're like me, you followed the proceedings on Twitter. And I hate to leave you all in limbo, but we still don't know quite what the court has decided there. Hopefully sometime in the next few weeks, maybe. So one of the important things I think I want to mention about the Clean Power Plan that helps understand some of the awkwardness and some of the conflict and the lawsuits related to the Clean Power Plan is that it kind of bridges an awkward gap for the EPA, that the EPA knows, and mostly I imagine everyone in this room knows, that it's generally most efficient and most logical to try and regulate CO2 at a system level, the entire economic system or an electricity grid, for example. However, EPA traditionally has the most experience regulating emission sources, right? And the EPA tends to fall back onto using the best system of emissions reductions, whatever that happens to be for your pollutant and your source. For CO2, the EPA decided that the best system of emissions reduction was composed of three things. First of all, improve the efficiency of coal power plants. Second of all, switch from coal to natural gas, fuel switching. And third of all, to use renewable energy to displace both coal and natural gas. And they used these three concepts and did a plant-by-plant analysis of every plant in the US, looking at the capabilities of each plant to achieve reductions by each of these means. And these plant-by-plant analyses were consolidated up to the state level to give state-level requirements for emissions reductions from the power sector out to 2030. As many of you probably know, they talk about the overall reductions from this plan reduce electricity system emissions 30% over the next 15 years. They talk a lot about flexibility. There is some flexibility in the way the states are allowed to pursue targets, and they can try and pursue a total CO2 mass limit by 2030, a rate limit by 2030, and the differentiation there, in a sense, is for states that expect to have a lot of load growth, may want to pursue a rate limit instead of a total mass limit, or other in-state or interstate plans, trading, whatever, that will result in similar amounts of reduction overall as approved by EPA. One of the big sticking points that this plant-level analysis brings up is potentially unequitable distribution of emissions reductions. So this is a state-by-state listing of what percent emissions reductions are expected under the Clean Power Plan. And you'll note that some states are expected to reduce almost nothing, 5, 10, 15%. Other states are expected to reduce by up to 50%. And I don't want to get too political here, but you know, am I the only person that this kind of reminds you of an electoral college map a little bit? Right? That it almost looks like you're penalizing your political enemies. However, of course, the EPA, in EPA's defense, would say, no, we're not penalizing anyone. We did a very rational, straightforward analysis. And the states that aren't required to reduce emissions are the ones that can't reduce emissions very much from these three mechanisms. And the places that are the most dirty, the Midwest and the West, they could reduce emissions an awful lot, very cost effectively, and it's their duty to do so. Now, I'm not going to judge that argument. That's actually the argument that's currently being judged in the courts, and so hopefully we'll hear about that soon. So at that, those are my initial opening comments, but I'm not the real act, I'm just the starter. So I'd like to invite Christine Tezak to come up and speak. She's the Managing Director of Research at Clearview Energy Partners, and she leads their analysis and coverage of electricity markets, infrastructure, and environmental policy, so she's a perfect person to come and speak about the Clean Power Plan.
Thank you, Eric, and apologies in advance to all of you. I don't know what happened between my computer upstairs and this one in terms of what's going to happen with the animation and transitions here. So if anybody gets a little seasick, I apologize in advance. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate today. Just a couple of minutes about who Clearview Energy Partners is. Clearview Energy Partners is a Washington, D.C.-based research firm. We're not a consulting firm. We develop our own research and then we convince our clients that it's really wonderful and hopefully very useful. It was founded by Kevin Book, who was formerly a sell-side analyst who followed policy issues for Friedman Billings Ramsey, and Chase Hutto, who had been Dick Cheney's energy advisor until, as he likes to say, he and his boss were fired by the American public. Get you ready so that we drink the bar upstairs, because this panel we're gonna represent. I followed what we call at Clearview regulated energy or power pipes and pollution, and I joined the firm in 2012 after thinking that in 2009 I was going to join a nice little Midwest regional investment bank and do clean tech and be retired by now. But here I am still doing power pipes and pollution because the world just kind of didn't work out so well that way. The clean tech revolution has been hit by this horrible thing called a shale gale, and it's been a little complicated ever since. And what we do at Clearview is we take what we would call a top-down approach to investment implications, and since Kevin and I both worked in the brokerage business, what Chase brings to our practice is a knowledge and an understanding of the levers of government and how they work. You know, Kevin likes to say that he and I used to peer through keyholes, and Chase was the one standing on the other side of the door with all the levers saying, where do these go? And the interesting and relevant thing about that, and what's relevant to this conversation, of course, is that the law is the law. And we have a certain amount of statutes and regulatory mechanisms that provide a certain field of activity, but certainly not a boundless field of activity. So one of the things Chase brings to our practice is an understanding of where those bounds and limits are. And of course, the people who pull the levers certainly can change, as we're contemplating great change in a couple of weeks perhaps. But the levers only perhaps move so far. And so part of what we'll be talking about today is just how far those levers may move. So at Clearview, we're analysts, we're not lobbyists. We don't represent corporate or partisan interests in any fashion. And frankly, if at least some of our clients are unhappy when they've read our report, we've probably kept it right in the middle of the fairway. So, and because Chase is a lawyer and Kevin and I worked in the brokerage business, this is the little piece of slide that says anything I told you today could change tomorrow because I've been informed by something else. So to talk a little bit about what we're looking at in the context of the Clean Power Plan, yes, it is a very broad-ranging, ambitious program that uses Section 111D of the Clean Air Act to address what EPA viewed as a gap in regulation. GHGs are not considered to be criteria pollutants, so they're not like nitrogen oxide, SO2, particulate matter, and they're not hazardous pollutants like mercury or other neurotoxins. And so this other sort of high volume, low toxicity pollutant EPA felt was best regulated under Section 111, especially after, as Eric mentioned, in 2007, the Supreme Court said, enough messing around, go forth and regulate. So what is most important, I think, about what we've experienced over the last 7+ years is a change in the vocabulary that has taken place in the power sector in particular, notwithstanding anything that happens with the Clean Power Plan. We would point to the fact that this administration frequently references climate, that they talk about a climate crisis, not climate change. It's a climate crisis. It's something that necessitates a response sooner rather than later. And greenhouse gas emissions are not simply emissions. They're pollution. And governments are often charged with resolving pollution. That's their job. They're supposed to put limits on things that are bad for us. And that's one of the things that we think has really materially changed under this administration. We're also operating in an environment where most states have renewable energy programs. They may be softer targets than others, but if you add it all together and you're looking at 2030, we have a de facto program on the books. If you add up all of the state targets and they meet them, we'd already be at nearly a 12% renewable portfolio standard in the United States, something that the Congress has contemplated but had yet to pass. But it's already happening, and it's happening at this disaggregated level. Environmental activism is likely to persist regardless of who is president. Oil companies are also under shareholder pressure to acknowledge, address, grapple with their greenhouse gas pollution. And we, of course, had a massive agreement in Paris talking about limiting GHG greenhouse gases because of concerns about the elevation of world temperatures. So this is something that the next president is going to inherit anyway. So this election may not be about energy policy, but it's going to matter a great deal, and a lot of it has to do with what falls to the next president in terms of the Clean Power Plan. We, of course, have a continuity case, which would be if Hillary Clinton is elected. We probably have a Congress that's going to remain pretty thinly divided. Even if the Senate changes hands, it would likely be by a narrow margin. My greatest fear as a Virginian is that Hillary Clinton will get elected, we'll have a 50-50 Senate, and we'll have yet another election in Virginia to fill Tim Kaine's seat. So not looking forward to that. They've been fast and furious on the airwaves in the Maryland and DC area. We get a lot of overlap in Pennsylvania too. It's never ending. And we may not have a lot of visibility beyond the next 4 years, if that. In fact, if Hillary Clinton manages to come into office with a Senate majority, it may be a thin one, and then the Democrats will be able to defend about 24 seats in the next electoral cycle. So that will pose a challenge to her, because she'll have a question of, does she do as much as she can in the first 2 years and risk losing the Senate, or does she play a safer role and try to hold on to it? And these are questions we can't even begin to ask. So we are seeing environmental obligations growing, but absent the Clean Power Plan, the biggest driver on the electricity markets is really MIA right now. and it's leading to a significant amount of excess inventory in the power markets. And so no matter what happens, there's a couple of things I want to zip through because I think it's important to how we contextualize any discussion that follows what the court does at the DC Circuit level in terms of the Clean Power Plan. The first is that the world is changing. We're seeing an ongoing devolution of power to nation states at the expense of multilateral institutions and growing primacy of local governance of central authority. And Erica, who knows my partner Kevin, knows that he wrote that and not me. Brexit was relevant. We're seeing the breakdown of big global multilateral institutions. Kyoto was a very different treaty than what we saw negotiated in Paris. Paris is very much bottoms up. We're all committing to something and hoping we can pull it off, as opposed to a top-down, here's everybody's target, go forth and figure it out. And in the United States in particular, there's a huge amount of fragmentation at the policy level. We have what we call the frack attacks, the local ground war. My colleague Tim Fox talks about solar advocates pivoting to the people if they can't get through the PUC, and states denying infrastructure their needed permits. And so to illustrate this a little bit, because I should have pictures occasionally because Kevin says I'm too wordy, one of the things we saw in shale is first you had regulators push on the states, worrying that they're not doing enough to protect water quality. And then you had the states push back with preemptive self-regulation saying, hey, no, EPA, we got this. Thanks. Producer states aren't really in love with federal oversight, so they're like, no, we got this. But then those same states are feeling pressure from their local constituencies and their local cities to do more or to have a different and more stringent approach towards environmental stewardship. And you see that in the U.S. even in the power sector, where you have states and municipalities talking about their particular climate strategy. Even though they're a little bitty part of the globe, they still believe that it's important for them to have their climate strategy. And this is something that is going to persist even if we don't get the Clean Power Plan. Fundamentals, wow, how many times have you heard today we're long everything. Energy intensity of GDP is declining, manufacturing jobs are down, they're up from where they were in February 2010, but they're still down relative to 2009. The energy intensity of the U.S. economy continues to decline. And political impact, energy goods and services is a percentage of real personal consumption expenditures. For those of you who survived yesterday's panel, I mentioned it's been falling about 0.5% every 5 years since the turn of the century. And this is a big deal because, you know, we used to have a power sector that had a very tight correlation with organic growth from a generation perspective with GDP, and it's broken. It's been broken for a while. We're seeing a real separation of power demand and GDP growth. And so one of the interesting things when you look at the regulatory impact analysis for the Clean Power Plan is this fabulous resource. It's huge. It's called none. It's actually a declining demand. You can talk about demand destruction or you can talk about energy efficiency, but the point is that we continue to do more with less. And that is something that is unlikely to change. And as energy gets cheaper, it's more problematic, as we heard yesterday from the Senate staffers who were with us. It's hard to figure out how to get people motivated to talk about energy policy. And this is why I think you see a movement in the United States to talk about environmental policy as the motivator and to cast it in rather apocalyptic terms. We also see this as what we call a fuel fight. You know, when you look at the power industry, you know, it's easy to beat up on the utility. They're there, they're reliable, they don't move real fast. Power plants don't get up and move down the block. We can talk about factories getting up and leaving the United States, but those power plants, they just don't go. And in spite of all of the, you know, the criticism I think utilities get, you know, there's really something about their commitment in terms of capital, the amount of money that's involved, the regulatory compact that is underpinned service here in the United States. And all of those things are tremendous advantages, along with a balance sheet that has very attractive capital costs right now. But it certainly doesn't make the utility business invulnerable to change. And, you know, when you look at the decline in commodity prices, it has really facilitated a questioning of the existing utility infrastructure. You know, when you read challenges to pipeline siting, one of the arguments that comes up very frequently is, why do we need this? Never mind the firm contracts that are actually a prerequisite for showing up at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to get a pipeline built anyway. But it's a bigger question. It's, why do we need this 40 years from now? Or do we really need it 10 years from now? Maybe we don't need this pipeline 10 years from now. Maybe we shouldn't be looking at building 40-year assets of any kind if they combust fossil fuel hydrocarbons. And it's a very big policy question that we hadn't dealt with before, because we were always building to the next increment of growth. We were growing very fast, we needed more. Now we have a very big conversation that's very different in terms of how you service these needs for energy. EPA talks about these transitions towards cleaner natural gas, lower emissions, renewable energy, all that other stuff is locking in trends. The objective of the mercury neurotoxic standard was to lock in trends from the move to gas. And so too they have couched in large part the Clean Power Plan is that it's supposed to help just move people along in the direction they're already going. So when we talk about the president, we talk about the Clean Power Plan. This is a decision that is expected to come down from the DC Circuit sometime after the election. Clinton would represent continuity. Certainly a potential change in the Senate is going to color Supreme Court opinions and Supreme Court appointments, and we can talk about those later. But it would shift the majority potentially from the Republicans to the Democrats. And incremental greenhouse gas regulation is probably more likely than not. Secretary Clinton would inherit President Obama's promise to live up to the Paris Treaty, and that would need to have additional commitments from the United States, and we look for them to take place most likely upstream in the regulation of methane from existing wells. If Trump is elected, then we have a question of just how much of this election platform, such as it is observed in practice. He's promised an EPA regulatory review. He could attempt to undo a win at the DC Circuit by not enthusiastically defending the Clean Power Plan on appeal. We can't find any mention in the Supreme Court Procedures Manual that would prohibit the EPA saying, you know what, Supreme Court, you're really, really busy. Don't you worry about this little appeal thing. We're going to take the rule back on reconsideration. We're going to work on it. It'll be great. And we'll renegotiate it. It'll take us 6 years, and it'll go off, and it'll disappear. For the power sector broadly, there's been a lot of pressure on FERC and regional transmission organizations to help figure out how to manage or trade carbon. You know, who are going to be the appointments at FERC if, Donald Trump doesn't know what LNG is? So it's a pretty big question of whether or not he's going to call the shots or whether he's going to pass those decisions off. So when you look at the Clean Power Plan, especially the coverage that you see, the easy call for anybody to make is if the whole thing succeeds or the whole thing fails. Part of the litigation strategy was to see if they could unwind it completely by claiming a conflict between Section 111 and Section 112, which regulates hazardous pollutants. That argument did not seem to go over well even with the Republican judges. The best systems of emissions reduction, BSER, would be a pretty big win for EPA. If they're upheld on BSER, even in a divided court, that puts the wind at their backs. And it's easy to sort of estimate what we're going to look at for Clean Power Plan options if BSER sticks. But courts have a nasty tendency of not doing anything that's particularly black or white, even if the question appears binary. And one of the things that I've heard people talk about in DC is, what if EPA is limited to blocks 1 and 2, which is energy efficiency and switching to natural gas? That presents a very different set of outcomes that may be much more difficult to anticipate in terms of emission reductions. I think that in terms of shifts, it's pretty easy and it's a good story for gas, but it's not clear that we would make the ambitious targets that the nation has set for itself, or President Obama's administration set for us, in the Paris Agreement. The en banc review provides the DC Circuit with an opportunity to really talk through all of the issues that were raised. And one of the reasons many people believe they took this step is because this may be the decision that prevails, particularly if we wind up with a 4-4 deadlock at the Supreme Court. And by default, the DC Circuit decision stands, however it is written. So there's a belief that the DC Circuit takes its potential responsibility very seriously and is looking to make sure they give it the most robust hearing they can. A partial remand probably inevitably leads to some sort of appeal at the Supreme Court, but we're not sure that's the only outcome we could get. One of the things that's not been clear is why exactly Justice Kennedy supported the stay. There's some speculation at SCOTUS blog that he's a big states writer, and the idea of having a federal implementation plan become binding as early as September 2016, before the justice system ran its course, might have been something that he could not endorse, even if he thinks EPA is doing the right thing. Well, that issue would be off the table. So if the DC Circuit writes a robust decision and the Supreme Court has a lot of backlog because they've been setting cases aside with their 4-4 divide, it's not a high probability event, but there is the possibility that the Supreme Court would decline to take cert. And in which case, the stay would dissolve, the Clean Power Plan could stand, and EPA could say, SIPs, 2018, see ya. And let's put this buggy back on the road for 2022. Personally, I think that would be the best outcome for the power industry, because it would reinstate the regulatory impetus to move dirtier assets out of our stack. If we get a DC Circuit decision that doesn't come till next spring and we have a President Trump, it looks like we would probably have the Clean Power Plan shelved indefinitely, because either they could bring it back, seek to strike a settlement with opposing parties to bring it on remand or on reconsideration and just sort of shelve it. What we see most utilities and their policymakers prefer is an absence of volatility and stable prices. States also like to make decisions on their own without an excessive amount of micromanagement from federal government. And that's what they look like. I think EPA's strategy going into the Clean Power Plan was to make some of their flexibility look so complicated that a mass-based cap and trade system looks a lot easier, and that moving from state to regional to national trading is something that would sort of take care of itself organically. And I think that if we get a Clean Power Plan, it will probably trend that direction, particularly if the next thing that EPA does is go after greenhouse gas emissions at refineries and takes a broad BSER approach to that sector as well, looking at the content of the fuels as a system and as the refinery product, instead of merely just the emissions that come from those facilities. So without CPP, we have too much of a good thing. We have older assets that don't go away. We have a 5-year extension of the PTC and ITC, which keep bringing renewables. We have consumers who want to be prosumers and supply for themselves. That is really wreaking havoc in some states on the net load curve and how power is supplied to them. Demand is stagnant or declining, independent of any new federal policies. We can probably thank the Energy Independence and Security Act, and a lot of those energy efficiency targets that were established 10 years ago are finally starting to come in. And from my perspective, I am much more interested in a utility that's doing lots of investment in distribution in partnership with their state regulator than they are trying to build transmission over people who are fighting everything every step of the way. We do have risks and vulnerabilities. How long do these robust generation resources last? Weather can bite us in the butt. We saw that with the polar vortexes. Our peaks get peakier and our base loads get lower. Bridging that delta in a hurry remains a challenge. We have upstream gas risks, whether it's financial pressures causing consolidation in the industry and lowering production, or, as in Oklahoma, there's a seismic event or other water quality issue that generates a regulatory response, or worse even yet, a congressional stampede. We have midstream risks, safety and infrastructure. And if we don't get the Clean Power Plan, one of the things that we'll be watching, particularly if we get a Trump presidency, is whether or not we get tax reform. President Trump, if he goes to office, would promise not to cut entitlements. He's going to have tax reform at the same time. He's going to need a hell of a lot of money. And one of the ways to get there would be to establish a carbon tax. And if it's revenue neutral, then one could make the argument that there are participants in the energy industry who's like, we'll take your carbon tax if you make EPA go away. Now, that's probably viable under a Trump administration. That probably doesn't hunt so well if Mr. Podesta has anything to do with it, but it is definitely something that we would watch for, particularly in the absence of a clean power plan. It would allow a Republican administration to claim consistency with a prior administration, but doing it their own way, or renegotiating the deal, however you like to choose it. So we'll know in a couple of weeks what the answer is on continuity. That'll help frame the outcomes we'll look at when we get a decision from the DC Circuit. We expect state policies to continue, but they will probably be particularly relevant for clean technology companies if we have discontinuity with the Trump administration. Other court decisions will continue to shape the energy sector on multiple levels. Congress and tax reform do their thing. But overall, we expect the biggest complication to be this sort of long situation we have in power supply, that we just have a lot of it. It doesn't make it easy for new technologies to compete. It keeps old guys hanging around. It's leading to massive out-of-market subsidies in New York, power purchase agreements that are above market in other states. And so what you have is a shrinking market for power in a substantive fashion. So I'll leave those little Molotov cocktails around there, and those are questions for them. Or I can do some questions now.
Okay, well, let's thank Christine.
That's right. My name is Galen. I've had them otherwise.
Yeah, we have time for a few questions, so if we have one or two questions.
Hi, so you think the market is long, does that take into account, I mean, all the coal retirements that are coming down the pike because of MAPs and other things, independent of CPP? You still think it's very long?
Yeah, it's still very long.
On a generation front.
If it wasn't that long, we wouldn't have nuclear plants setting up for retirement. We've got gas plants that are under recovery in several of the restructured markets because the coal hasn't gone away. Plus, you have wind coming in that is changing the power balance and the dispatch. And so, you know, the one thing we talked earlier about forecasts, you know, you look at capacity markets, and I'd submit to you that capacity markets are perfect. They solve perfectly. The problem is the E&AS assumptions, the energy and ancillary services assumptions are always wrong by the time that year comes along. So we have this disconnect where nobody's really making any money, and a lot of the complaints that used to get FERC with a small c, not with a big filed C, but a lot of the frustration that power producers are seeing is that the market conditions are soft and it's tough to make a living. And you know, consumers benefit from this oversupply, but the coal units are not exiting anywhere near fast enough. And what happened with MATS, everything, if you were not MATS compliant, you were done in April. And we have not seen any sort of significant power price strengthening in the wholesale markets. It's a little better. But looking down the road, you know, if it looked like it was going to continue to get tighter, then there really wouldn't be, in my view, this discussion about whether or not we have to preserve these nuclear assets, because you just look at it and say, okay, it's going to be a couple of lean years, but I'm going to make it up on the back end and I'll be fine. And there's no evidence of that. If anything, what we're seeing is the inverse, particularly in New York and in Illinois. So, you know, if that's where we're at on the restructured markets in particular, Charles has got it going on, he's fine. But he doesn't have those horrible little restructured markets messing up what they've got going on. And, but in the restructured markets, the price formation continues to be a huge problem before FERC. It's something they just seem to be getting on top of.
Yes, we're talking about various groups who protest against fracking and progressive activists. But isn't there also a larger question of local control with protesting against wind farms, for example, and protesting against just about the kind of local issues that could, in fact, impede any kind of changeover in terms of power system. And so, at what point do you see a local control issue becoming important in this particular context? Because it doesn't
That's the one, it's actually the community next to the one that's having the wind farm. The renewable folks are pretty surprised when they get pushback from environmentalists when it comes to citing their projects. We've seen pushback on solar facility siting in California. There's issues with wind generally. We've seen that even in the Midwest, usually due to noise. We're seeing it a little bit in Pennsylvania, but not as much. The larger the project is relative to the size of the community it's closest to, has a lot to do with that. But I would say we're already seeing it, and we're seeing it when there's a perception that the power isn't going to be consumed directly. So to the extent you're seeing projects that are built with an eye towards giving independence, control, increased reliability or resiliency to a local community, those are the ones that seem to have the ingredients to move forward. But if it's a community that's sited next to a utility scale facility where that power is going to somewhere else, then there seems to be an entirely different dynamic. So we look at it more as this issue of, where it's going, because that's consistent with this fragmentation theme that we're seeing, that there's an interest in microgrids and in islanding and in providing their own power and becoming sustainable on their own, and less magnanimous views in terms of hosting large-scale facilities, particularly if they're going to be noisy.
I ask you to hold your question, Claudia. So for the sake of time, we should press on. Sometimes when you look at the Clean Power Plan, it seems like the primary design criteria was to keep electricity system economists in business. It gives us all lots of work to do. So for academics like me, you get very excited, think of all the research papers that you can work on. For Charles Rossman, I don't think he's quite as excited about the Clean Power Plan overall. So Charles is the forecasting and model development manager for a Southern company, an electric utility in the South, and he's in charge of analyzing the effects of environmental policy and working out the implementation plans of the company. And so I'm really excited to hear what Charles has to say about how they plan to respond to the Clean Power Plan.
All right, great. Thank you, Eric, and thank you, Christy, for a great introduction to what the Clean Power Plan is. I do not have slides, and instead I'm going to walk around and talk. What I'm going to talk about is way at the other end of the spectrum from where Eric and Christine started, and I'm going to talk about one little detail. I'm going to give a little bit of introduction to what Southern Company is, a little bit more introduction about how the Clean Power Plan works, and then identify a problem that Southern Company identified in the way it works, and the solution that we have articulated in some formal comments to EPA about solving that problem. So that's the agenda. A few minutes on Southern Company, a few minutes on Clean Power Plan, a few minutes on identifying this problem, and then the solution, and then I'll sit down and answer some questions if you got. So Southern Company is a large, vertically integrated, traditionally regulated electricity utility in the southeastern U.S. We have 4 operating companies, 4 main retail operating companies that operate in 4 different states. All of the units that serve the power in these 4 states are operated as a single entity. That is, they're centrally dispatched, centrally committed and dispatched, centrally planned. The power plants and the transmission and the operation are all planned and done together as a single unit for this large area in the South. We are one of the entities which Eric mentioned. Some folks have sued EPA over the old Clean Power Plan. Southern Company is among them. And so when Eric invited me to give this presentation, I had to say, I can say some things. There's some things I can't talk about. And so I just recognize that we have a fraught relationship with the Clean Power Plan and EPA on the topic. So who had heard of the Clean Power Plan before you saw it on the agenda? Hands up. Okay, good. Hands up, let's see, hands up now if you know that if you could distinguish between the rate-based approach and the mass-based approach. That's a smaller group. How many know whether the state that they live in is leaning toward a mass-based approach or a rate-based approach? Good. And how many have seen a price projection for the trading instrument? How many know the name of the trading instrument in the rate-based approach? Oh, good, we got a couple. How many know what a gas shift ERC is? Oh, we got one. All right, two. Okay, good. And how many have seen a price projection for ERCs? And how many have seen a price projection for the mass-based instrument called allowances? All right, so what I'm going to talk about on the Clean Power Plan has to do with this multiple worlds that EPA is setting up in the Clean Power Plan, and a little bit about an interest that Southern Company has in having a window opened between those two worlds. So the Clean Power Plan provided a bunch of different options for states to choose as to how to comply. EPA provided a particular target for each state in either a mass-based approach or a rate-based approach. And then a few different versions that you could take. If the state chose a mass-based approach, there are a couple different flavors there, and a rate-based approach, a couple different flavors there. But EPA provided the key targets in each of these areas. California is likely to have a particular approach that California's been working on for a long time. The RGGI states are likely to stick with RGGI and enhance it a little bit, or change it, or make it be their program for satisfying the Clean Power Plan. But the rest of the states are likely to choose between a rate-based version and a mass-based version. And as EPA set it up, these two worlds, that is, the set of states throughout the U.S. that adopt a rate-based approach and the set of states that adopt a mass-based approach, are not there is not instrument trading between these two worlds. So in the rate-based world, the instrument is called an emission rate credit, an ERC, emission rate credit, and those things are available. I'm going to talk mainly about, it gets even nerdier, the subcategory-specific version of the rate-based approach, because we think that that's the approach that most folks are going to take. So subcategory-specific, when I say rate, I mean subcat. And so subcategory-specific, the instrument that circulates is called an emission rate credit. In the mass-based version, the instrument that's going to circulate is called an allowance. And that's supposed to be similar to the acid rate trading program, where we've got or other trading programs that have been created where there are allowances. EPA says how many are available. You print up the certificates. You either auction them or allocate them, and then they circulate. And if you emit a ton, you better have an allowance by the end of the compliance period, and hand in an allowance to cover the emission. So each unit that emits CO2 in a mass-based program is obliged to, at the end of the whatever the true-up period is, at the end of the period, to have procured allowances, either bought them or had them allocated, bought allowances, and hand in one allowance per ton that the unit emitted. So it's a unit-level compliance program, and you got to acquire your allowances and hand them in. In the rate-based version, similar. In the rate-based world, states that adopt a rate-based program, each unit is responsible for having its emission rate be below a target. And so the target is expressed as a particular rate. So there's a rate for fossil steam units, and there is a rate for natural gas combined cycle units. These rates differ, and they start in 2022, they start a little bit higher, and they fall over the years to get to 2030. Same as in the mass-based approach, the target starts high, and then it gets smaller over the years of the program. In the rate-based approach, the target is a rate, and so each unit will have a rate that it must meet. And the rate is, numerator is pounds emitted by the unit over whatever the compliance period is, and the denominator is the number of megawatt hours that it produced. So pounds divided by megawatt hours, and so that rate, that ratio must be below the target that EPA has put forward. Most units cannot meet that target, whatever it is. That is, without doing either installing a carbon capture program or something else. But EPA provided a way to meet the target anyway, and that is to pad the denominator. That is, you have pounds in the numerator still, and in the denominator, you've got megawatt hours produced plus the number of ERCs that the unit procures and hands in. So you can reduce your ratio, pounds over megawatt hours, by adding these ERC things in the denominator. And so, just like in the trading program, just like in the mass program, you got to procure your allowances and hand them in to cover your emissions. Here you got to procure your ERCs and hand them in to make sure your ratio is below the target. But these ERC things and these allowance things are very different. They have different roles. They're different. They aren't used by units in the same way. And because they don't mean the same thing, they aren't both a ton of allowance, they aren't both a ton of emission, for example. EPA was concerned about being able to cross-trade, that is, have some trading ratio that would be, well, each ERC is worth about this many allowances, or a set of trading ratio. And they were rightly concerned you could increase emissions a lot if you allowed sort of free trading. And so they prohibited trading between these two worlds. All right, I'm going to go back to Southern Company. Our problem. The way the math worked out, and the way that the targets that EPA established worked out, one of our states looks very favorable in the rate-based version, much less costly. Other states, not ours, but others also, the utility commissions are sort of inclined to do this mass-based thing. And in fact, Christy said as much. I mean, we're familiar, we know how it works, cap and trade, we know how to do that. That sounds okay to us. Sounds complicated enough. And this rate-based thing, let's set that aside. Okay, but we've got a problem, and one state at least, looks really good under the rate-based thing. And we'd like to be able to have that state choose the rate-based approach because it's much less costly. Our states are among those, again, that sued EPA and are among the ones that are looking to comply with the Clean Power Plan at least cost. We think some other states might be interested in having compliance at most cost, having it most stringent. Ours are the other end of the spectrum. Low cost, least stringent, least onerous, try to get us there. So, the states that have states that are thinking of going the rate-based approach, there aren't very many of them, at least not right out of the box. So our concern is that this one state might be an ERC island, emission rate credit ERC. So it might be an ERC island. That is, it's the only place where these ERC things trade. And our concern about that is a price formation concern. So in I think I mentioned that our fleet operates as a single entity. In order for that to work, we have to have the incremental dispatch price at the unit be based on pretty solid price discovery of everything that goes into its dispatch number. So its incremental cost has to be based on its fuel, a market-based fuel price, market-based SO2 allowance price, market-based NOx allowance price, and a market-based ERC price. Well, if there ain't any market, or there's a very thin market, or we only get price discovery every so often, that's a problem. It's also a problem if the ERC market in this state ends up being a really stringent program. And we would rather prefer the mass-based program. Okay, so the idea is we would like to allow units in this state to use allowances that they buy on the allowance market from all the other states that are doing the mass-based version and use them in compliance in this state. But we want to do it in such a way that it has a very high degree of environmental integrity. In particular, what we want to do is if we take an allowance worth a ton out of the mass-based program, move it to the rate-based program, we want total emissions to increase by nothing, no increase at all. Take an allowance out of here, move it into the rate-based world, and have total emissions not increase at all. That is, we want this allowance to be worth 1 ton in the rate-based program. How do you do that? How do you want it to be worth exactly 1 ton? When in the rate-based program, you've got this ratio that you're trying to do. So it's pounds in the numerator, the denominator is megawatt hours plus ERCs, plus gas shift ERCs. All right, so what we have proposed to EPA is a unit-specific number, specific to the unit, to each unit, that allows allowances to be added in the denominator. So in a rate-based world, it's pounds divided by megawatt hours plus ERCs plus gas shift ERCs plus alpha, a factor we labeled with that, times the number of allowances that the unit hands in also. And it's figuring out what that alpha has to be. What do you get to multiply your allowances by in order that you preserve environmental integrity? That is, 1 ton taken out of the mass world, we're going to emit 1 less ton in mass, we want to emit only 1 ton more in rate. And so figuring out what that alpha is, it turns out, if you care, it's 2,000 times the quantity, 1 over the rate at the target, the rate in that year for that unit, minus 1 over that unit's emission rate. Simple, huh? All right, so that's the answer. We wrote this up, and it was fun to write it up and to see it appear, and all the math that derives it in the Federal Register. So we have forwarded this in formal comments, so it looks formal comments to EPA, coming up with this solution. We also worked it out the other way. That is, if you want to use an ERC in a mass, you want to use an ERC in a mass-based world. That one's even tougher than I've been able to spend to describe in 15 minutes here. But the thing to do here, the problem we identified, and a constructive way to sort of suggest how to address a problem that we saw with the Clean Power Plan, both our implementation of it and satisfying EPA's objective of ensuring environmental integrity of the whole thing and presumably decreasing the cost of compliance with the Clean Power Plan by if one system ends up being a little bit more stringent than the other, the trading can help alleviate that to some degree. And so this is increasing efficiency, decreasing cost of achieving the environmental objective. We have written this up in formal comments and submitted to EPA, and EPA has said thus far, yep, we hear you, sounds good. We may do something with it. But for now, it's just sort of sitting there. I'm happy to take any questions, but that's my story of an item at the other end of the spectrum on level of detail on the whole Clean Power Plan, right down in the make it work. Yeah. Cool.
So, I guess this is a question that what we've just heard about powers of the Clean Power Plan and how in the way of the state.
Yeah.
How has Southern Company reacted? Are you operating in a world where, my assumption is somehow that people are still somehow assuming that it will happen or something like it will happen. Is this true, or you have altered everything?
So, let me give a bunch of different answers that could be given. Certainly, the company continues to do analysis and thinking about the Clean Power Plan. Our states have generally decided not to proceed, but we all still attend meetings and talk a little bit about these things. They can't spend any money on it. but they'll show up at meetings if they're in town. And so, yeah, and that's sort of a political, pencils down because of the stay. But yet they know that something will likely happen that they need to deal with. So we're proceeding to think about it. It's an important, regulation, and we need to proceed as if it may come to pass in about the form that it's there. I'm passing no judgment on whether that's likely, but in the comments I've made here, I have acted as if it's an important proposal and that we want it to be as workable as possible if it were to come into effect. Yeah.
Say a few words about why you think the subcategorized approach is preferable. So thinking theoretically that a more flexible system would be more efficient. It seems like it's less efficient.
So subcat versus what's called hybrid.
Right, or blended.
Blended.
Right.
Yeah, subcat versus blended. Okay, so this is in the rate world. There are at least two different versions. One is the version that EPA gave a particular rate to each state, and that's called blended. And then the other is the one that I emphasize, and that's subcategory. All right. The reason there are a couple of problems with blended. The first is that it is not. There is no interstate trading at all with blended. So the way blended works, you can, if two states get together, and 2 or 3 states get together and jointly design a program, then all of the units in that state are going to be subjected to a blended rate for that state. But that's the only way that there can be interstate trading of the instrument in blended. I'll get back to that in a minute. Whereas in subcat, it's deemed trading ready from day one, because every unit that elects subcat is subjected to exactly the same rate. So 2 observations. Subcat is we have found, subcat is likely to be less stringent than blended. In fact, we have usually found that. So that's one reason. The other is that we don't think that any states are going to join. And the reason to not do that is that one state, if 2 states join and get a rate in the middle, one state's a winner and one state's a loser in that. And it's like, if you're the loser state, it's like, what? I'm not. Why would I do that? So we don't, for those 2 reasons, we don't think that focusing on blended is worth it. Yeah?
How does the allocation of the credits happen?
Oh, I didn't do that, did I? Oh, I skipped that part. So in subcat, where do the credits come from? That's a great question. So in a rate-based approach, the credits are created by generating electricity from a non-emitting resource, a new non-emitting resource. So that's solar, wind, nuke. So those, generally that's it. So if you generate a megawatt hour with a new solar facility, you're awarded 1 ERC. Another way to earn ERCs is also with energy efficiency improvements. So if a megawatt hour is created, then an ERC is awarded. And so that's where they come from. Yeah.
Has Southern's acquisition of AGL resources played into how you're going to be dealing with the clean power plan? Or was that just a separate strategic decision? I mean, it is a large gas utility.
Ask the beginning again. I didn't get the right.
Is Southern's acquisition
of
AGL resources,
yeah.
How does that play into with dealing with the clean power plan?
So the question is, Southern Company recently bought